Welcome to Exhuming the Truth, the podcast that is dedicated to cold cases, missing persons, systemic injustices, and the art of forensic science that seeks answers when silence remains. My name is Asha Carmody, and I am a forensic scientist and a criminologist, and in each episode we examine the evidence, the systems, and the human stories that are often left behind. This isn't just about true crime, it's about the truth. It's about accountability, and it's about giving a voice to those who deserve to be heard. Thank you so much for being here. Let's jump right in. Boy, do I have a chaotic housekeeping for you. As always, you can skip through if you're just here for the content. If you're happy to listen to me have a little waffle, here we are, so stick around. We have been super busy, and I have to say that I feel like everything kind of all rains down at one time. We are dealing with absolute chaos in the business, so much going on, so much paperwork and things like that. And just when I thought I'd have a little rest on Saturday over the Anzac Day long weekend, Saturday night, my 7-year-old fell over, hit his head on his brother's TV and TV unit and floor, and ended up needing to get his perfect little chin glued back together and some stereo strips. So it was very eventful. I ended up taking the day off the next day just so I could be with him and, rest and recoup together, because we were both very tired after that. Now, anyway, before we get into today's episode, I'm obviously going to go into a little bit of housekeeping, because this past week has seriously been one of the biggest and heaviest and most significant weeks in Exhuming the Truth history. Now, firstly, many of you will have seen that after literally 7 months of work and a lot of uncertainty, a lot of paperwork, and even more imposter syndrome, Exhuming the Truth Hope Project Limited has officially been approved and accepted as a registered charity by the ACNC. I am absolutely over the moon, but equally as much in shock. I honestly gave up hope that we were going to get charity registration. So much so that I kind of went quiet on it for a little bit. My husband kept talking about it and I'm like, yeah, we'll explore other avenues and just stick to not-for-profit, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so we actually kind of started getting a wriggle on with the not-for-profit side before we got approval, and started opening up bank accounts and registering lots of things. And then obviously, while that's all pending, we got approved as a charity, which is amazing, but we've just got to upgrade a few other things. So I know it might look like we're not doing a lot, but there's so much happening behind the scenes, particularly around separating work that is charity work versus Exhuming the Truth as it stands on its own. So we're actually going to have a separate website for Exhuming the Truth Hope Project, so that it's very clear what is the charity, and then separate that from the podcast and our current social media pages, just to be completely transparent. All of the money that I'm going to be receiving through Exhuming the Truth, which, by the way, again, is not a lot, but I'm just going to be putting that straight into the charity anyway. I just think that the work that the charity does is so valuable that I don't really feel the need to kind of hold on to any sort of money coming my way with Exhuming the Truth by just doing a podcast and kind of being a voice for people. So I will be putting it back in there. But anyway, as time goes on, we'll be a lot more clear with that. That obviously means that the advocacy and direct assistance side of what I currently do, that can actually formally operate through the Hope Project, which includes things like the victim advocacy, connecting people with services, missing persons and cold case assistance, search coordination, search efforts, and broader systemic injustice work. So it's actually, an enormous step forward in allowing this work to grow into something that's sustainable and accountable, and most importantly, it's capable of helping more families in meaningful ways across Australia, New Zealand, and soon to be international. So to be clear, Exhuming the Truth as you know it is going to remain kind of this, what would you call it, like a bit of a media and education arm. So we've got the podcast, content, awareness campaigns, merchandise, academy work, and all of that is going to be under Exhuming the Truth, while Exhuming the Truth Hope Project is going to operate as the charity and the frontline advocacy arm, so that advocacy service. So I will also, like I said, be donating the proceeds from any subscriptions and that into the charity to help fund that work, because it's really important. So secondly, many of you would have seen that the crowdfunding campaign we posted on our Facebook is also on our Exhuming the Truth website. If we had the Exhuming the Truth Hope Project Limited website up and running, it would be on there. But we have started a crowdfunding campaign launch to help get us to Queensland. So this support is actually going to directly assisting us in being able to respond when families need boots on the ground, specialised assistance and coordinated search support interstate. So this is actually specifically to help Kelly Moody with her son, Jack McLennan, who's been missing for way too long now. And that is to get myself and one other adult there and on the ground for around 3 days would be ideal. That is the goal. So even if you donate, $2 or the price of a coffee, if you can, that would be amazing. Even if you can't, if you could share that, that would also be amazing. It's super important to us to be able to travel interstate to do things like this. And honestly, if we had the funds, we would have been there day one for each and every one of our cases, but especially this one because Kelly, she really opened up herself and her life to me when I had just started Exhuming the Truth and didn't really have anyone behind me here in Australia to be like, oh yes, I've used her and she did a good job. She kind of she let me do the work that I'm doing now without knowing me or knowing my background, which was amazing. So I would love to put all of that back into helping her find Jack. So your trust in this mission obviously means more than I can adequately express. So on the case front, this week it's been really devastating. Later today, this afternoon, a missing little girl in the Northern Territory, the 5-year-old, she was tragically located deceased. So out of respect for the ongoing investigation and the family, I'm not going to be naming her here. Like many of you, I'm absolutely heartbroken. It really honestly made me feel sick. There's just simply no words sufficient for the loss of a child at all. And yeah, our thoughts remain obviously with her loved ones. And I know this news has deeply affected so many people across Australia, as it rightly should. It's very distressing. And this tragedy also kind of serves as a bit of a reminder, I guess, of why advocacy must be responsible and why we have it in the first place. And the public frustration is very understandable and the emotion is understandable, but I have to say, as I did on Facebook, that we've got to be really careful with speculation online. If you're having a conversation with somebody next to you, that's one thing, but speculation and rumors and unverified accusations online can actually do a lot of harm to getting justice, and it can impede the investigations. I know it's annoying and it's not ideal, but the most respectful thing that we can do in moments like this is allow the investigators to do their work and use very careful language like alleged and things like that when we are in active pursuit of justice. In other casework, efforts are just being continued behind the scenes in relation to over 50 active matters we've got at the moment. So that's obviously including our advocacy and search coordination work. Unfortunately, I can't publicly discuss in full due to operational and legal considerations, but please know that work is continuing even where it may appear quiet. We are working towards hopefully getting a video together for Corey Fian and his family in Lehman. This week has been full on, guys. It's been a profound reminder of both why this work matters and how heavy it can be, because the wins and the grief often arrive hand in hand in this field. And one moment you can be celebrating progress like with the charity, and the next you're grieving with families and communities. So to everyone listening and supporting and subscribing and volunteering, and even if you just simply believe in what Exhuming the Truth stands for, thank you so much. It's not anything new to me now, knowing that as our platform does continue to grow, which is fantastic because we're getting more reach for more families, but as it does continue to grow, we are getting an influx of a bit more rough commenting and messaging. So we're trying to also deal with that and also kind of allow myself, I suppose, the time to step away from social media and things like that when it is getting a bit heavy. So I appreciate everybody so much for considering that. And let's just jump into today's case. Welcome to the murder of Shandee Blackburn and the DNA disaster that has shook Australia. There are some cases that expose not only a killer but an entire system, and cases that force us to confront an uncomfortable truth, and that is that justice is not only vulnerable to violent offenders but to institutional failure. So tonight's case is one of those cases because while this episode begins with the absolutely brutal murder of a 23-year-old beautiful woman walking home from work in regional Queensland, it actually ends with forensic scandal so profound that it called into question the integrity of tens of thousands of criminal investigations across Australia. And this is not only the story of who killed Shandee Blackburn, it's the story of what happens when science fails the dead. Welcome back to Exhuming the Truth. I am your host, Asha Carmody, forensic scientist and criminologist, and tonight we're examining the murder of Shandee Blackburn and this DNA disaster that her case has exposed. Let's talk about Shandee, because before she became a headline and before she became a case file, she became the centre of a national forensic scandal. She was a daughter and a sister and a friend, and she was only 23 years old and living in Mackay in Queensland. And those who knew Shandee described her as all of the wonderful and beautiful things that you could describe somebody that you loved and cared for deeply. They said she was kind and she was warm and she was deeply family oriented. She's been also described as being vibrant and social, and at 23 she obviously had her whole life ahead of her, and like so many victims that we discuss on this show, she should be remembered first and foremost for who she was in life and absolutely not for what was done to her in her death. So on the night of February the 9th in 2013, Shandee had finished her shift at Harrop Park Country Club in Mackay. She actually then decided to walk home from her shift, and it was a route that she'd taken before. It was familiar to her and a relatively ordinary act. It was routine. It was familiar. It was unremarkable. But sometime after 10:30 p.m. that night, that routine was interrupted by extraordinary violence. Shandee was actually ambushed in the street and she was stabbed repeatedly. Now, witnesses later reported hearing screams, and emergency services rushed to the scene and they found her suffering catastrophic injuries. But despite desperate efforts by the first responders, Shandee Blackburn died shortly thereafter, and she had been stabbed more than 20 times, which is absolutely insane. And immediately, the investigators on this case knew that this wasn't a random kind of superficial altercation. This was definitely rage-fueled and it was definitely overkill. And in forensic behavioural analysis, overkill often suggests something important, and that's that violence exceeds what is necessary to cause death. And this can actually indicate emotional arousal or even a personal grievance, a fixation, or even a relationship conflict. And while overkill alone can not definitively identify an offender, it often shifts investigative focus towards someone known to the victim and somebody with motive, and someone that you could say has emotional investment, and it's definitely somebody with a lot of anger. Now, it didn't take long for police to focus their attention on Shandee's former partner, John. Why? Because statistically and behaviourally, intimate partners and former partners remain among the highest risk offender groups in female homicide. Now, his name was John Peros, Peros. Now, it's reported that the investigators in this case considered, obviously, the relationship history she had here, any potential interpersonal conflicts, so like friendships, work conflict, things like that, any witness accounts, vehicle evidence, timeline inconsistencies, and behavioural indicators after the offence. But importantly, police believe that they had assembled a compelling circumstantial case. But circumstantial evidence, as we know, while it can be powerful, it often requires corroboration with some solid evidence. And this is where forensic science should have entered as a pillar of support, except it didn't. So come the trial for Shandee, this is 2017 now. And we have John Peros, her partner at the time, and her former partner at the time, let me correct myself, and he stood trial for Shandee's murder. And the prosecution presented its case, but without this decisive forensic evidence linking him directly to the attack outside of circumstantial evidence, they had a bit of trouble because they were relying heavily on circumstantial and behavioural interpretation. And in criminal court, as we know, that matters greatly because no matter how suspicious someone might appear and no matter how strong police intuition might be, the burden does remain on the prosecution to absolutely prove beyond reasonable doubt that a person is guilty. And that's the highest legal standard in our justice system. So what happened was the jury acquitted him and he walked free. And for Shandee's family, this verdict was understandably incredibly devastating. But the story didn't end there, because come a few years later, there was a coronial inquest, and in that inquest, they revisited the evidence. And in 2020, the coroner found that on the balance of probabilities, John Peros was responsible for Shandee's death. And that finding actually shocked many listeners who were unfamiliar with the legal distinctions, because it's important to clarify here so you don't walk away confused like many people after this inquest. A coronial inquest isn't a criminal trial, okay? It's a criminal conviction that requires proof beyond reasonable doubt. A criminal conviction requires proof beyond reasonable doubt. A coronial inquest does not, because it's not a criminal trial in that sense. The coronial trial uses the lower civil standard, which is the balance of probabilities. Which in simpler terms is, in a coronial inquest, a coroner can conclude somebody likely committed an act even when criminal conviction wasn't possible, like in this case. So for Shandee's family, this provided some measure of validation, but still there had been no criminal justice and no conviction, because there's no conviction after a coronial inquest. Now, this also means there's no legal accountability, and then comes in the revelation that changed absolutely everything in this entire case. Now, in our earlier episodes, we did talk a lot about forensic failures and gave a lot of examples of that. And I think this is probably one of the biggest, if not the biggest, forensic failure in our country. So we have investigative journalist Hedley Thomas, and through his podcast, Shandee's Story, he began examining the case in extraordinary detail, and it's fantastic. If you haven't listened to it, I highly recommend. And his reporting raised really serious concerns about the forensic evidence. So these concerns actually triggered an independent review by forensic DNA expert Dr. Kirsty Wright. And what she uncovered was absolutely just staggering. The Queensland DNA lab had made major errors in its handling and its interpretation of forensic samples from Shandee's case. Now, according to this review, the lab actually failed to detect DNA in samples where DNA should have been present. Now, some samples deemed unsuitable or insufficient for testing, and those samples were actually later shown to contain usable DNA, which is absolutely unacceptable. And in one of the most shocking findings, this lab actually struggled to reliably identify even Shandee's own DNA in key blood samples collected from the crime scene, which is that it's just unheard of. Let that sink in. A murder victim's own biological material couldn't even be properly identified in her own homicide investigation. This is not acceptable in any way, shape, or form. This is not a minor clerical issue. This is a catastrophic forensic failure. Like, this is embarrassing. I remember when all of this was happening, because I was still at university at the time, and it was absolutely outrageous. If we can't ID the victim whom we know and whom we have samples from, how on earth is there any fucking chance at all for an accurate reading of any other related DNA sample? And if you're not kind of clocking on to why this matters forensically, as a forensic scientist, I really need listeners to understand something critical, because when the public hears no DNA was found, people automatically assume that that means the suspect must not have been there, and this is dangerously simplistic. Now, DNA evidence is not binary, and what I mean by that is its recovery depends on a number of things, and those things can be anything from the collection quality, like how you collect a sample, how you preserve that sample, and the conditions that it's preservated, that's not even a word, it's preserved. What am I even talking about? I'm getting like so overwhelmed. How that sample degrades over time, what extraction methods, we use, the competence of the analyst doing these tests, the protocols in the laboratory where these tests are being conducted, and how we are interpreting. This is not going well for me. How we're interpreting thresholds. That's the right word. Oh my God, wow. It's been a long week. I'm so sorry, but I am so passionate about this, and I have actually waited because I meant to record Tuesday. I forgot to say, but all of my software needed updating at the same time, conveniently. So now I'm just getting too into it and I can't even speak. But basically, the absence of the detected DNA doesn't mean that there's an absence of an offender contact. So when inside the lab and, there's this mishandling and the testing's inaccurate, they can create these false negatives, almost like a pregnancy test. And this gives an illusion, to people that aren't super familiar, that there was no forensic evidence at all. And, the forensic evidence doesn't exist when in fact it does. And that's exactly what's happened here. And this has created a huge scandal, because if you think this is bad, just wait for what I'm about to tell you. Because what began as concerns about Shandee's murder case, which standalone is absolutely outrageous, this actually exploded into this statewide forensic crisis. And yes, my friends, we're talking about Queensland. They have a lot to answer for, because this inquiry then found the Queensland Forensic Lab's DNA testing processes had systemic flaws. Now, the threshold settings, the interpretation methods, and the reporting practices had resulted in potentially flawed outcomes across, drumroll, thousands of cases. Not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands. Now, these cases included sexual assault investigations, homicides, violent assaults, and plenty of other major indictable offences. Like, I've been aware of this, and I will still never recover from this at all. I cannot believe it. In fact, I think I'm going to do another episode on it, like just on... Actually, I might add it to my Queensland episode that I've got in the making. Because cases previously thought to have no DNA evidence, of course, were reopened for review now, because there was so much going on with Queensland forensics and samples had to be retested. And then these victims were obviously, called up and informed that forensic opportunities in the cases may have been missed, which is a complete miscarriage of justice. Imagine learning years later that the evidence in your loved one's murder or your own rape or your assault may have been mishandled by the very institution entrusted to seek justice for you. Now, this is a very large part of the reason why I chose to open Exhuming the Truth instead of working for a forensic lab. I just absolutely cannot stand for anything like this. Like, I would be ashamed. I would quit my job. Like, it's unreal. These cases... And this case actually particularly forces a very difficult but necessary conversation. We often speak about forensic science as though it's infallible. Like lab evidence is objective truth, and as though science itself cannot fail. But forensic science is only as reliable as the systems behind it, the protocols governing it, the people conducting it, and the oversight holding it accountable. Science is not immune at all to anything like this. It's not immune to incompetence. It's not immune to institutional complacency. And when forensic institutions fail, they don't fail in isolation. And is this not the perfect, tragic example of failing people, and failing people in their death, failing people in the worst moments of their lives? It's insane, because flawed forensics can both let guilty offenders evade accountability and wrongfully implicate innocent people. It's absolutely insane, and it's why forensic integrity really, really matters. And not because science is powerful, but because when science is wrong And when things like this happen, it's authority that can make that error really devastating. And like I said earlier, I remember clear as day where I was when I read this and learnt about it, because I thought, oh my God, this is an absolute miscarriage of justice and embarrassment to our industry. Like, I can't believe that we are, living in a time where this is happening. Shandee Blackburn's legacy shouldn't be reduced to a scandal. She was way more than, the way that she had passed. And she is still way more than, a story or a case that has exposed a broken lab. But in her death and in exposing this, she has in turn saved a lot of people, and it's sad that it's worked out that way, because she was a young woman whose life was stolen through brutal violence, and yet through the pursuit of truth in her case, her name became attached to something larger, something enormous, and a forensic reckoning, if you will, an absolute demand for accountability, and a reminder that justice requires a lot more than investigators and courtrooms. It actually requires institutions worthy of public trust, because when forensic science fails like this, justice fails with it. I want to thank you for listening to this episode of Exhuming the Truth. And if this case has moved you or challenged you or even changed the way that you think about forensic science as it did for me, please share this episode, because the public scrutiny is often actually what forces broken systems to change. And if you have thoughts on whether forensic labs in Australia should be independently audited nationwide, I want to hear from you, because I am absolutely on that bandwagon and I'd love to have a chat. My name is Asha Carmody. I am a forensic scientist and a criminologist and a human rights advocate. I am your podcast host here at Exhuming the Truth. I love you and thank you for joining me and for giving life back to these people who had their lives stolen from beneath their feet. It's absolutely abhorrent, and the least we can do is aid in justice for the victims and their families. If you've enjoyed it here, please consider subscribing on our Facebook page. That allows us to do the work that we do behind the scenes and a lot of victim advocacy work. You can find us across all social media platforms, basically anywhere and everywhere. YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, you name it. Please share us. Please share our episodes. Please help us keep these names alive. We appreciate all of the work that you guys do as a community, from sharing and discussing. It makes a huge difference, while it might not seem like it does. So thank you so much. I hope you've enjoyed it here. Stay safe. We'll chat again next week. This is Exhuming the Truth. I hope you have enjoyed it here. Have a beautiful day.